coronaviruses circulate in bats. And so there's an ancestral link to bats, and that is something that we know based on the genetic sequences of this virus and other coronaviruses that circulate globally. So we know that bats are an ancestral link. What we really need to understand is the intermediate host, the animal that was infected by bats and that infected people in some of these in the earliest cases. And that's a very important piece to understand from a public health perspective so that we can prevent that from happening again. We've learned this in MERS, for example, in the beginning. We didn't know the intermediate host for MERS, and there were investigations that were taking place in the Middle East, and there was a link that was made with dromedary camels. This happens for a lot of these zoonotic pathogens. And what we need to do is we need to do these investigations, these studies to better understand what is the animal host for COVID-19. We have discussed this with our colleagues in China, and we discussed it during the mission that I took part in February. And one of the recommendations was to be able to do those investigations and do those with our colleagues at FAO and OIE and different ministries across China. And this is an important part of our understanding of how this all began, so that we can prevent it from happening further. From all of the evidence that we have seen, from all of the sequences that are available, and there are, I believe, more than 15,000 full genome sequences available, or close to 15,000, that this virus is of natural origin. But we do need to still find the intermediate host in China, and that is something we are very supportive of to provide that support to our colleagues in China.
No, we have not received any data or specific evidence from the US government relating to the purported origin of the virus. So from our perspective, this remains speculative, but any evidence-based organization, we would be very willing to receive any information that purports to the origin of the virus, because as Maria said, the origin of the virus is a very important piece of public health information for future control. So if that data and evidence is available, then it will be for the United States government to decide whether and when it can be shared. But it's difficult for WHO to operate in an information vacuum in that specific regard. So we focus on what we know, we focus on the evidence we have, and the evidence we have from the sequencing and from all that we have been advised is the virus itself is of natural origin, and we need to understand more about that natural origin, and particularly about intermediate hosts. This issue was one of the recommendations of the Emergency Committee on 30th of January. It was subsequently repeated in the advice the other day. The Director General, when he visited China when I was there with him, raised the issue at the highest level, not as a specific issue, but we've been saying this since the beginning. We have to control this outbreak, and this is the most important thing we have to do. But we have to also understand the origin so that we can put in place the right public health and animal-human interface policies that will prevent this happening again. This is not unique. We have done the same in the Middle East with MERS. We have done the same with Ebola in Africa. Understanding the host animal, understanding the intermediate species, and understanding how to protect human beings in that cycle is exceptionally important. Whether that requires changes in our engagement with the natural environment, whether it requires changes in animal husbandry, when it requires changes along the food chain, we won't know exactly how that is to be managed unless we understand the animal host and the animal intermediate species. And that's an exceptionally important piece of information. Right now, we have to deal with the pandemic, and we've got to get it under control, but that does not lessen the importance of doing that other work. We have offered, as we do in every case with every country, assistance with carrying out those investigations, and I'm sure our colleagues in OIE and FAO are equally keen to offer that support. But again, a bit like the mission in February, we need to understand that we can learn from Chinese scientists, we can learn from each other, we can exchange knowledge, and we can find the answers together. If this is projected as aggressive investigation of wrongdoing, then I believe that's much more difficult to do. But that's a political issue. That is not a science issue. We see scientists in China communicating, collaborating around the world right the way through this pandemic. We would like to see that spirit continue, and we would like to see scientists at the center of the exploration of the source of this. Science needs to be at the center. Science will find the answers. The implications of those answers can be dealt with from a policy and political perspective. So if we have a science-based investigation and a science-based inquiry as to what the origin species and the intermediate species are, then that will benefit everybody on the planet. And we believe that can be achieved with the appropriate approach to that. Very important question.
It's Simon Ateba from Today News Africa. Simon, can you hear us?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My name is Simon Ateba from Today News Africa in Washington, D.C. WHO Africa released a statement not long ago about that WHO welcomes traditional medicine. I wanted Dr. Tedros to expand on that, what they mean by traditional medicine. Do we mean black magic, or what do they mean? And I also wanted WHO to react to the controversial bill being introduced in Nigeria, the infectious disease bill. Are you concerned that some government may use the coronavirus to turn their country into the police state? Thank you.
A statement on this does support the use, as we do all over the world, of there's a difference here between what are natural remedies or natural supplements where people take things to feel better, and if people want to take a honey and lemon drink in order to ward off infectious diseases, that's a very different thing to taking a drug with an active ingredient, whether that's of natural or pharmaceutical origin. What we're talking about here are potential treatments that have active pharmaceutical ingredients. And an active pharmaceutical ingredient can help you if it's targeted at the virus that's infecting you, but it can also hurt you if it affects any other system and doesn't deal with the virus. So what we try to do in medicine is not make the difference between what are pharmaceutical agents and what are traditional. I think what we found more and more in the world, that sometimes what ends up as an agent or as a drug coming from the pharmaceutical side very often starts as a traditional medicine. Aspirin, anti-malarial treatments, many of these came from traditional medicines that were well recognized by communities. And then when the active ingredient is identified, that's often taken and developed and scaled up and put into tablets. So we must recognize that traditional medicine has a value both clinically and socially and culturally. But what we do want to make sure is that any of those products that have active pharmaceutical ingredients in them are tested in the same way as normal drugs. And particularly in the context of Africa, we want to make sure that any material, any drug going into the body of an African gets exactly the same testing and safety and efficacy trialing as it would in any other part of the world. So this is not about denying Africans traditional therapies. This is about making sure that those therapies are safe and effective. And WHO will support those researchers who have traditional medicines that have some potential or are showing some promise or have some indication that they may work, and we will support them in building the necessary clinical trials that can test the safety and efficacy of those potential traditional remedies. This is both as a way to protect people from remedies that may hurt them, but also to select out those remedies that may actually work in this case. Maria?
But the idea of traditional medicines, particularly for COVID-19, is something that is well under investigation. There's hundreds of clinical trials that are ongoing right now, and it is important that these are done through these types of studies called clinical trials. Even within China, the use of traditional medicine, many of them are under clinical paths, been working with a number of research groups to ensure that any drugs, whether it's traditional medicine or whether it's Western, quote unquote Western medicine, that